Thank you for coming out again tonight. This is a little bit of background. This is based on a couple of different talks I've given this summer as part of a larger project that I'm hoping will eventually turn into a book on sleep and sleeplessness, but in particular a Christian ethical account of what's going on in our country surrounding sleep. So these are typically the areas that I like to research. The last thing I wrote was on slowing down human aging and evaluating that from a Christian perspective. And so this is kind of in the similar vein. We don't find a lot of, at least I think, good things written about sleep. So bear with me, because you may feel ripped off. The theology part is going to come much more at the end, because I do think there's a method to my approach. One of my favorite ethicists, Oliver O'Donovan, said, it's hard enough to bring Scripture to bear on contemporary issues, but what ethicists, Christian ethicists, especially tend to miss is this bigger question that comes first, and that question is, what in the world is going on? So rather than launch into sleep and sleeplessness without trying to answer that first question, we may miss lines of inquiry or some questions that could be addressed with specific theological themes, etc. Okay, that's enough. That's enough of that intro. So here we go. A good night's sleep is something once considered rather prosaic or mundane has become a good deal more difficult over the last several decades. A 2024 Gallup poll reflected on what we already seem to know, and that is Americans are sleeping less and more stressed than ever, with 2/3 of women under the age of 50 reporting that they're not getting enough sleep. And they also happen to report the highest levels of stress. And maybe it shouldn't be too surprising to observe this, given that 3 of the most popular memoirs on the experiences of insomnia have been penned by women. Samantha Harvey is a writer. She lays bare her fears in her year-long struggle with falling asleep. Heart, I'm quoting now, heart, thrup, 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 scalp tight, now my small room is overbrimming. The louder thrupping of my heart, lying on one side, cradling my head. Sleepiness vanishes like the picture when you turned off an old TV screen. It recedes into a dot. In her memoir entitled Sleepless, the French psychoanalyst Marie Darissec chronicles her battles with insomnia in an attempt to quiet, and I'm quoting her, the castrol oil drum going glong, glong in my head. She says this: I've been running on barbiturates for almost 30 years. I savor soporifics. I booze on benzodiazepines. I stagnate on sedatives. I'm hypnotic with narcotics. Other sleep tactics have proven equally ineffective for her, including yoga, meditation, fasting, a gravity blanket or a weighted blanket, and a mat of synthetic flowers to lie down on. In addition to the physiological distress, Darissec says that insomnia is freighted with its own moral baggage. To sleep poorly, she says, is poorly regarded against the, quoting here, the sleep of the just, whose consciences are supposedly clear and clean. There's another point at her book where she says the prophet Jonah should be the patron saint of insomniacs because Jonah can sleep in the middle of a tumultuous storm. Jonah's sleep is a sleep of forgetfulness. Harvey, too, senses this. She reports hearing the word greed whispered somewhere in the darkness. You are too greedy for sleep, she writes. Jesus, quoting now, slumps backwards, dead, mouth agape at the ceiling, unquote. The suggestion of employing a sleep hygiene seems to chide insomniacs for their dirty habits. Another author, Marina Benjamin, speaks of insomnia's isolating effects. It is, bottom line, a condition of profound loneliness, and not even a dignified loneliness, because in insomnia, you are cannibalized by your own gnawing thoughts. With, however, the development of sleep medicine, our late modern era has witnessed the advent of sleep disorders like narcolepsy, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, sleep work shift disorder, non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder, parasomnias, insomnias, REM behavior disorder, and others. It's a growing list. But nearly 1/3 of Americans will suffer from one of at least 75 different clinical sleep disorders at some point during their lives. Sleep disturbances are far more prevalent among women and more likely for everyone as we age. Nearly half of all people 65 and older will have some complaint of disturbed sleep. But insomnia in some form is by far the largest culprit, right? Up to 40% of adults may be suffering from insomnia today. And that's generally defined as a difficulty in initiating or maintaining sleep. Now, while the stories of the advent of sleep medicine are numerous and contested, a more clinical understanding of insomnia arrived in 1979 with the publication of the first diagnostic classification of sleep and arousal disorders, which listed 68 different sleep-related disorders based not on signs, but rather on symptoms, following the general approach of psychiatry. These disorders have been divided into 4 categories. Bear with me. I'm going to try to situate insomnia in the bigger medical field before I attempt to say something useful. But these disorders were divided into 4 categories of initiating and maintaining sleep, disorders of excessive somnolence or sleepiness or the desire to sleep, sleep-wake cycle disorders, and dysfunctions associated with sleep and sleep stages or partial arousals. As you may suspect at this point that the field is getting enormously complex. There are only at present a few conditions that can be adequately treated by medication or surgery. For most disorders, and this is especially true with insomnias that are not caused by some other condition, treatments range from cognitive behavioral therapy to changes in personal habits or societal arrangements, what we might call sleep hygiene. But these show varying degrees of efficacy. A couple more cumbersome terms, and then we'll focus more on it, what I'm just going to call insomnia. There is another term that is more technical. It is called, what I'm addressing tonight, psychophysiological insomnia or primary insomnia, which is far and away the most common form suffered today. This identifies in particular the stress that accompanies the physiological arousal as a primary cause, as opposed to a secondary insomnia, which is often a symptom of some other pre-existing medical, psychiatric, or environmental condition. I'm going to try to, so we're focusing just on this first bullet point. And these are broken down into subdisciplines or subcategories, I should say. Primary insomnias. Again, psychophysiological insomnia is being stressed out over not being able to sleep, which merely perpetuates the inability to fall asleep. Paradoxica should be an L there. This is what happens when you throw together slides at the last minute. Paradoxical insomnia is the phenomenon of not feeling like you've gotten enough sleep, even though the feedback from the sleep lab tells you, oh yeah, you slept 8 hours and you slept well. Nevertheless, you don't feel like you slept well. Idiopathic insomnia is it's just a fancy word for saying we're not sure what the cause is, but there is some underlying cause. And then there is insomnia from poor sleep hygiene. So from here on out, when I talk about insomnia, I'm talking about these subcategories that are not related to some other medical condition. Typically what happens is that insomnia occurs in a response to a very stressful event in life. The death of someone close, a poor medical diagnosis, divorce, relationship failures. There's no shortage of things to stress us out. But in such cases, this kind of insomnia is initially referred to as some type of adjustment sleep disorder, and if it persists, it eventually gets classified as insomnia. Again, treatment is generally along the lines of perhaps a temporary course of medication, but stress on the temporary, redeveloping a positive association with your bedroom and your bed or your sleep environment, and good sleep hygiene. And I'll throw out a couple mundane examples, like don't be looking at your smartphone right before you go to bed. Don't consume alcohol before bed, etc. But these significant life events notwithstanding, the occurrence and experience of insomnia is certainly influenced by our habits, our behaviors, and these vary with age, gender, inherent predisposition, and incidences of other diseases and related medications, among other factors. Okay, so North Americans, again, as I mentioned earlier, have been getting less sleep over the last several decades. Another study from 2018 reported that nearly a third of Americans sleep less than 6 hours a night, which is up from 28% in 2004, with Hispanics and African Americans faring even worse. The 2024 Gallup poll I cited a few minutes ago noted that in 1942, only 3% of the population reported sleeping 5 hours a night or less. 5 hours. Today, that's 1 in 5 of us. 20% now report getting 5 hours or less a night. North Americans are also world leaders in unused vacation time. Ours is a 24/7 world with ubiquitous screen time and energy drinks. Just as a quick aside, we lived in Scotland for 4 years, and when my wife took a full-time job with the National Health Service, she started with 5 weeks of vacation. And that's standard in the United Kingdom. They look at us and think we're just barbaric. And they have a point. But the health impacts also are, there's no secret here, of getting less sleep, regardless of the causes, are very well documented. Include cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, among other things. Uncontrolled sleep apnea, for instance, has been linked to depression, anxiety, and irritability. And untreated, sleep apnea is fatal. Sociologists, philosophers, I'm not including theologians here, historians have pointed out that our issues concerning sleep have a lot to do with the invention of artificial light and the development of technology, which has disrupted our natural sleep rhythms. That is certainly part of the problem. But it is not entirely clear, and I think this is an important point, it is not entirely clear whether insomnia is a disease or a symptom, or whether it is both. So one main goal of the project that I'm working on, and this is what you're going to hear tonight, is I am going to try to tease out the distinctions between what goes by sleep hygiene and how Americans understand sleep hygiene versus a spiritual practice of sleep, or even an asceticism of sleep, if there can even be such a thing. So. In the second half of this talk, I am going to reframe sleep and sleeplessness in light of not our capitalist economy, but in light of God's divine economy. So I have 4 big points to make about sleep hygiene in our modern era. Hygiene takes its name from Hygeia, the Greek goddess of health, daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine. It's just the obligatory, anytime you talk about medicine, usually you have to mention some Greek god. The Oxford English Dictionary defines hygiene as, and I'm quoting, that department of knowledge or practice which relates to the maintaining of health. So sleep hygiene seems rather obvious and intuitive. It seems clear enough. It speaks to the practices that promote good sleeping on a regular basis. And without a doubt, there have always been remedies for getting good sleep in the history of humankind. These include, I'm still trying to make sense of this, include the judicious placement of sheep lungs on the side of one's head, dripping poppy juice into leech bored holes behind your ears, or just a warm glass of milk. But the advent of sleep hygiene in our modern era appears to be something more than simply updated techniques for inducing sleepiness or somnolence is the technical term. This is just, oh yeah, I should have talked about that slide, but I've already made that point. We'll move on. Here is just a smattering of what you'll find if you go online. There's the 5 principles of good sleep, the 4 pillars. Don't ask me what they are. At one point I knew, but you can look those up. There's also the 3 C's or S's, and there is the 10-3-2-1-0 rule of good sleep. Just out of curiosity, I do have somewhere here, yes, I have a footnote on what these mean. The 3 C's pertain to infant sleep: consistent, calm, and connection. The 3 S's have to do for what you use your bed for: sleep, sex, and sickness. Not surfing the internet. That S would not count. The 10-3-2-1-0 rule is no caffeine 10 hours before bed, no alcohol 3 hours before, no work 2 hours before, no screen time 1 hour before, and no hitting the snooze button. You may ask if life is even worth living at that point, if you follow some of those rules. We also have a new term that's been added to our cultural lexicon. It is called orthosomnia, defined as the obsessive pursuit of a perfect night's sleep. I don't even know what a coffee nap is, but I think what you do is you drink a cup of coffee, take a 15-minute nap, and then you're good to go. This was on the Wall Street Journal. This is from this year. The hottest new bedtime for 20-somethings is 9 p.m. This just gives credence to the phrase, youth is wasted on the young. But contemporary sleep hygiene differs from older methods in more significant ways, and I'll get to that in a second. So though this phrase, sleep hygiene, began to appear like in the late 19th century, Dr. Peter Hari, professor of psychology and clinical psychologist at Dartmouth, he is credited with bringing this phrase to prominence with the publication of his 1977 book, The Sleep Disorders. There he offered a scientifically informed rules to better sleep hygiene, and I'm quoting, which include establishing a regular bedtime, to strengthen circadian cycling, avoiding caffeine and alcohol in the evenings, attending to one's sleeping environment, the occasional sleeping pill if necessary, and this is my favorite, avoiding trying harder and harder to fall asleep. It's interesting that Hari himself disdained the phrase sleep hygiene because he thought it was too folksy and colloquial. And he expressed concern over releasing his rules or having other practitioners hand out pamphlets with his rules in the absence of more scientific background and discussion. He suggested that mental health professionals handing out his little pamphlets would be, I'm quoting now, no more effective than handing a neurotic patient a list of 10 rules for healthy emotional living, unquote. Rather, his focus was on summarizing the scientific research to help support the set of rules that will help us sleep better. William Dement is generally considered the father of sleep medicine. He was an ardent apologist of sleep hygiene. He wrote a book entitled The Promise of Sleep. I love this subtitle, The Scientific Connection Between Health, Happiness, and a Good Night's Sleep. He encouraged his readers to take seriously sleep seriously, I can't even talk now, as the foundation for good health. So he is a, this is the gospel of sleep medicine, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but he was intent on offering these salvific prescriptions to what he considered to be already in the 80s a sleep-sick society. Dement acknowledges that the founding principle, I found this interesting, which led to the establishment of sleep disorders medicine, was to treat the patient's sleep complaints by looking only at their sleep. If patients complained about their sleep, it was their sleep that should be examined, not their wakefulness. This was the conceptual breakthrough that established sleep disorders medicine. I don't think that's all bad, but I think that's, I think from a Christian perspective, we would hopefully say something more. And I will say something more. But this is a distinguishing feature of sleep medicine, namely its location within this new burgeoning discipline of sleep science. What about this sleep medicine? What about sleep hygiene? Here's point number one. I think in our late modern world today, sleep has become increasingly medicalized. But what does that mean? I'll get there in a second. Sleep is basically dominated in our culture by biomedical discussions bent on bringing it under our explicit control. In his work entitled Wild Nights, this is a great subtitle too, How Taming Sleep Created Our Restless World, Benjamin Rice says this, it's our sense that we can conquer sleep, we can tame it, we can make it conform. This relies on the same environmentally devastating mindset, an attitude of dominion over nature, including our bodies, through technology and consumerism. The sociologist Simon Williams views medicalization of sleep. This is like a more, it's a very precise definition. It defines a problem in medical terms, using medical language to describe the problem, adopting a medical framework to understand the problem, or using medical intervention to treat it. Williams is careful. He is not, he doesn't impugn imperialist motives to medicine itself. In fact, he thinks that oftentimes those who practice this just aren't aware of the implications. And here, in a later work, he draws a helpful distinction between what he calls medicalization and this very difficult word to pronounce, healthization. You may guess he is indeed British, and that might explain some of that. While the former, medicalization, advances biomedical causes and interventions with relation or in relation to sleep, the later, this healthicization, the latter advances behavioral changes, lifestyle changes, and interventions. Here he's, rather than belabor this, I need to see this on a PowerPoint slide to help make sense of this. He is drawing on another sociologist by the name of Peter Conrad. So if medicalization turns the moral into the medical, like we're going to study sleep from a scientific perspective, healthicization turns our health into a moral obligation. So there's multiple things going on. And if indeed this is the case, it is worth asking about the nature of these moral messages that are associated with the healthization of sleep or sleep hygiene. And I want to acknowledge, certainly, scientific and medical development surrounding sleep including the discovery of circadian rhythms, REM sleep, developments in brain science, the discovery of effective treatments for sleep apnea. These are all good things and have offered valuable insights into the nature of sleep and do indeed contribute to our health and well-being. While the advent of this international classification of sleep disorders has also contributed to medicalizing sleep, there are other spheres of influence, like the media, our capitalist economy, and a growing emphasis on the good sleep of the individual, the citizen, or society in the name of health, productivity, and well-being. Williams himself says, look, this is not all bad, for there are indeed some serious sleep issues that have been successfully managed due to sleep science. But in a later work, about 10 years later, he revisited this topic, and he was more disturbed after 10 years. And he said medicine's increasing power not only to control, but to customize the human body when it comes to sleep is troubling. And this certainly includes the growing influence of pharmacology on the sleep industry. He cites as an example this recent phenomenon known as SWSD, which stands for Shift Work Sleep Disorder, where a social behavioral problem is given a biomedical diagnosis to be treated with the wakefulness drug modafinil. But these treatments also stand in tension with cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which would include other practices like sleep restriction therapy, sleep position therapy. There is such a thing. Someone will train you which position to adopt to maximize sleep, and stimulus control therapy. Williams also expresses concerns over how the biomedicalization of sleep may foster a more neurochemical, in his words, notion of selfhood, especially as we have come to increasingly understand sleep not as inactivity, but as an active brain state. Finally, he observes that a continued focus on the promise of a good night's sleep as a passport to good health and to happiness and well-being can be problematic. And he notes that with the advent of our surveillance technology, I'm wearing one right now, responsibility shifts from the professional to the individual in the form of sleep hygiene. This is healthicization again. So sleep hygiene is thoroughly rooted in a medicalized understanding of sleep and insomnia. And contemporary discussions of sleep hygiene routinely acknowledge that it is incorporated as a psychological component to a clinical approach to insomnia, whether it's chronic insomnia or temporary. And I go back to Peter Harry's discussion of sleep hygiene, which he wrote about in a book entitled Sleep Disorders. I think that's worth remembering as well. I mean, not for you tonight, but maybe that's just a note for myself. What about the economics of sleep hygiene? So bear with me, we're already on point 2 of 4. This is complicated as well. For years, doctors have been worried about the health consequences of Americans' disregard for and mismanagement of sleep. Descartes, Hume, and Locke, all philosophers, were a few who disparaged sleep for its irrelevance in the pursuit of useful knowledge as part of a larger wresting of sleep from the notions of necessity or limit or nature. I like how Jonathan Crary put it in his book 24/7, I'm quoting now, "Within the globalist neoliberal paradigm, sleeping is for losers," unquote. He assumes that a temporal alignment of the individual with worldwide functioning markets has rendered irrelevant the distinctions between work and non-work time. And he sees sleep as the only remaining barrier to keep those separate, because capitalism so far has been unable to eliminate that barrier. Employers, too, express concern over lost income from poor sleep. So in the United States, the costs of insomnia are estimated to be as high as $100 billion a year, which reflects the indirect costs due to lost productivity or accidents or disproportionate usage of healthcare resources. And this connection between insomnia, hygiene, and the economy is already prefigured way back in 1919 in Good Health magazine, which described insomnia, and I'm quoting, as the most deadly enemy of business or the professional man. Benjamin Rice has also pointed out the larger social implications of this economic cycle. And I think he's right here, arguing that we're actually faced with two sleep crises today. There is a psychological crisis of sleep for those who live in relative affluence, for those who try to wrestle their sleep into submission. But he also notes that for many, sleep is an existential crisis, because they are expected to sleep according to the rules of others, but are often denied the time and space and security to do so. According to Rice, it is the economization of sleep that was begun in the Industrial Revolution that links these two crises together. But the very health and economic problems created by this paradigm promise to be addressed by the burgeoning sleep aid industry. In 2007, John Mooallem penned an article in the New York Times entitled "The Sleep Industrial Complex," to name the confluence of science, medicine, and consumerism in addressing sleep hygiene. Think about this. The National Sleep Foundation is a nonprofit organization largely financed by the pharmaceutical industry, while the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Better Sleep Council are nonprofits supported by the mattress industry, and they are fighting each other. Better drugs for sleeping and better beds are the way to an idealized, paralytic, oblivion-like sleep on demand, notes Mooallem. I'm quoting now, "Does your restless mind keep you from sleeping?" asks one Lunesta commercial. But mattress producers are ticked off at this. They deride the pharmaceutical approach to sleep as cheating, since it, and I'm quoting now, promotes sleep over all the rules you break. In other words, the use of sleeping pills in any form is bad hygiene. And yet, 18% of adults in the United States currently use some type of medication to help them fall asleep. Collectively, these industries are pushing the value of their products to help attain various life goals through sleep. Sleep better, lose weight. Sleep better, live longer. Sleep better, and be more productive. Sleep better, stay awake in church. But there's a troubling cycle here when it comes to sleep hygiene, because better sleep does indeed make us more economically productive, and it affords us the additional income to spend on the products that ensure that we sleep more efficiently and effectively. Rice, again, Benjamin Rice, has discussed the larger implications of sleep hygiene in this economic cycle. On the one hand, sleep is put in the service of profit. On the other, we now have a host of commercial products, promising us the possibility of the sleep that we so desperately demand. While biomedical attempts to control sleep intensify, competing economic interests, in Rice's words, pull sleep this way and that. This is the longest quote tonight, but I think it's very insightful. And so here we go. This is Rice. He says, "Our society seems to have radically restricted its meanings, that is, sleep's meanings, to the realm of medicine, hygiene, economics, and psychology. We need sleep, and we need to do it the right way, to be healthy, productive, well-adjusted. Sleep now inspires unprecedented levels of medical concern, along with pervasive anxiety and countless attempts at micromanagement. Pills and sleep clinics are only a part of this development, which also involves mattress companies, peddlers of self-help, big coffee chains, drowsy truckers, public health professionals, hyper-stimulating electronic devices, napping consultants." There is such a thing, a napping consultant, high-speed travel, higher-speed communications, scientific researchers, military planners, risk management professionals, labor organizers, governmental regulators, space travel researchers, self-monitoring systems, smartphone sleep apps, sleep coaches, online sleep therapy programs, and even smart beds that analyze our patterns of movement, breath, and perspiration. You can spend 10 grand on a bed to measure these things so that you can put that data to good use. One might say that in our current cultural context, sleep has come to be understood primarily as a limited resource that must be managed well. And certainly, I think the benefits of a good night's sleep are well documented, but Christians may want to challenge this rather narrow interpretation of sleep. 2 more points. Still talking about contemporary sleep hygiene. I think the third feature here concerns its stance on the body vis-a-vis our desires. Because in the face of insomnia, the sleepless body is viewed as the enemy, or at least the rebellious partner of the human will. As the theologian Sarah Coakley has noted, while materialism may be the dominant view or metaphysic, especially in the fields of neurology and science, some form of dualism persists to the degree that we still perceive some I or self over against or in relation to our bodies. In a sense, I think the sleepless body represents one of the last formidable affronts to our powers of control, our demands and desires, and our ability to create the right pill or even to find the right sleep routine. Curiously, one of the earlier instances of this phrase, sleep hygiene, could be found in a 1918 journal entitled Medical Insurance, where the author here, over 100 years ago, criticized hygiene as the human disposition, and I'm quoting now, to turn night into day or to dispense with sleep as far as possible in the mad rush for time. I wonder if the author is alluding to the prophet Amos in exposing our pretensions to the divine. Amos 5:8, and we need something redemptive tonight. He who made Pleiades and Orion and turns deep darkness into the morning and darkens the day into night, who calls forth the waters of the sea and pours them out upon the surface of the earth. The Lord is his name. I think there's also another interesting dynamic at work. On the one hand, we're encouraged to attend to our bodies by pursuing hygienic practices that will help us renew both our minds and our bodies, while on the other hand, we seem to be at war with our bodies, whether we battle against somnolence or sleeplessness. The irony has been well attested in the insomnia literature. The harder you try to fall asleep, the more elusive it becomes. You know, we can push ourselves in multiple different ways when it comes to the body, but we cannot force ourselves to sleep. Insomnia is, in a real sense, is a forceful reminder of our limitedness and our psychosomatic nature, which is unequivocally a good thing. And that's leading to a Christian approach that we're right on the precipice of. And yet we find pharmaceutical companies that want to recognize, or they do recognize this, they frame sleep as a matter of the will. Rice observes that the drug Belsomra treats insomnia neurologically. So it doesn't induce sleep, but it actually deactivates orexins, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain that keeps people awake. As he shrewdly observes, it's not the lack of sleep that's the problem, but it's rather being awake when you don't want to be awake. In doing so, marketers have tapped into the desire for sleep as sleep on demand as a way of exercising sleep over against the body. And then finally, the fourth point, I think sleep hygiene elevates the moral over the metaphysical. Metaphysical there stands in for, let's just call it a religious perspective, something that goes beyond the physical, what can be measured. In other words, with this statement, I'm trying to say that sleep hygiene is based on a rather thin morality that is blind or uninterested in deeper causality beyond what can be empirically measured or how it can serve as a passport to good health, well-being, and happiness, however you might define those terms. I think there's also a utilitarian calculus at work here. I'll summarize that as the greatest good for the greatest number. I think it's even appropriate to describe good sleep as a form of salvation. And while following sleep hygienic practices may indeed help us get a better night's rest, which is surely a good thing, it leaves broader questions concerning our anxieties, our habits, our dispositions, largely unasked and unchallenged. So when I say that sleep hygiene places the moral over the metaphysical, I mean to say that sleep hygiene ultimately doesn't account for what sleep is for. To put it technically, this is the teleological question. What is sleep for, beyond just the more imminent aims of being alert and productive at work? I think questions of purpose do arise with scientists when it comes to sleep, but they are incredibly frustrated because in an evolutionary worldview, sleep serves no useful purpose. In a world that is bent on predation and adaptation, sleep is not a good thing. Scientists cannot answer the question, what is sleep for? I think Christians can, but it's maybe not as easy as we think either. And again, I don't want this to be read as a methodological indictment of contemporary science. I mean, much good has been accomplished by a very disciplined focus on the things we can measure, right? To put it in Aristotelian terms, which is dangerous this late on a weeknight, by focusing on material and efficient causality. But here's the thing, if there's nothing that we can read off of nature, then nature can simply be seen as the raw material for our own prized projects of control. Here I'm borrowing and adapting from one of my favorite ethicists, Oliver O'Donovan, in an insightful comment he made in his work, Resurrection and the Moral Order. In this world, sleep is not for anything, but rather something for which we have found a use. That's a subtle distinction, and again, I don't want to unpack that now, but yeah, maybe some other time. Considering the purpose of sleep from a theological perspective, admittedly will offer its own challenges. And so finally, this is from a Swedish thinker. I lifted this from an article in First Things. It was out a couple years ago. I say amen to that, although theologians aren't really talking about sleep. So I want to situate contemporary sleep medicine or contemporary sleep hygiene in God's divine economy and thereby raising it to this metaphysical plane. After all, the very first mention of sleep in Scripture is a God-induced one. Genesis 2:21, if you want to look it up. This means considering sleep and its divine purposes, our own attitudes towards it, and our inability to procure it on demand and our practices surrounding it in light of God's divine economy as revealed in Jesus Christ and attested in Holy Scripture. Sorry, that's that's the really fancy, deep methodology in one sentence. In short, a Christian perspective on insomnia or sleeplessness will not consider it to be merely a physiological problem or a behavioral problem, but also a spiritual problem. And one way of helping clarify what theology brings to the conversations about sleep is to compare, I think, some of our own common existential attitudes about sleep and bringing those into dialogue with some Christian statements about sleep. And I'm going to summarize that in a couple PowerPoint slides. These are not mutually exclusive, by the way, the existential and the Christian. I think depending on our context and situations and history, I think there are days when sleep is a friend. But there are also times when sleep is viewed as an adversary or a limit or restraint. I think we can all maybe identify that there are times when sleep is used as an escape. It can be a reward. And here's the economic side. It is necessary for productivity, being a parent, being present, all of these kinds of things. And by the way, I appreciate you all taking notes, who are taking notes. I will email this PowerPoint to anyone who wants it. From a theological perspective, right, sleep is a gift from God. It is appropriate to our creaturely nature. It enables us to fulfill God's purposes for our lives, and it's also a reminder of our own approaching death, just as waking is a sign of the resurrection to come. If anyone can talk about sleep as death and sleep, death as sleep, rather, it's Christians, because though our time here on earth is limited, we look to the day when we wake up in Christ's presence. So bodily resurrection matters. So here's a couple of affirming points, and then a couple of real concrete examples that hopefully will be somewhat interesting. And we're almost through, and I'm happy to take questions as well. So here's some things I want to say. First, sleep hygiene is not necessarily bad. I think much good can come from it. I'm not here, despite all of the negativity I just dumped on it. There's good that comes from sleep hygiene. Nor, to be crystal clear, am I necessarily criticizing the use of pharmaceuticals to address insomnia. But I do think that the dominant discourse of sleep hygiene is unacceptably thin. Healthization won't cut it from a Christian perspective. So a theological perspective, hopefully, on sleep will invite us to consider our own sleeplessness and sleep hygiene in relation to the God who rests but never sleeps, and to the God who gives sleep to his beloved. That's Psalm 121 and 127, respectively. And the psalmist invites us to think of sleep as God's gift, though this concept admittedly will need some more unpacking, and this is some of the work that I still need to do. The second point is that if indeed sleep hygiene has become medicalized, Christians should be aware that while sleep medicine may indeed prove to be helpful, we also have access to the one who is able to expose and heal the hurtful habits and moral afflictions that often manifest themselves as disturbed sleep. So while insomnia might require being watched over by professionals in a sleep laboratory in a highly supervised, technologically mediated supervision, we as Christians are always under the watchful care of the Father, who is intimately acquainted with us and all of our ways, and especially mindful of the anxious thoughts that find us, surround us, and bind us. That last clause is from the artist Fernando Ortega in his song entitled Jesus, King of Angels, contemporary folk Christian artist. So third, if sleep hygiene is rooted in the sleep industrial complex, we are again mindful that in light of God's divine economy, Jesus Christ as Lord over our economic lives exposes how our work habits and patterns of consumption often fail to remedy what truly afflicts us. A theological perspective hopefully will expose the folly of associating sleep with weakness or reducing it to a mere means of economic productivity. And then fourth, if sleep hygiene treats the body as an adversary of the will, then the incarnation of Christ reminds us that embodiment, finitude, and sleep are good and proper to our creaturely existence. It reminds us that God has entered into our human condition, having experienced his own exhaustion and sleeplessness, having become also a sympathetic advocate on our behalf in the person of Jesus Christ, without at the same time ceasing to be God. So I was in church the other day, and we sang, as we do, we sang out of the hymnal, the 1982 hymnal, to be specific. And this phrase jumped out at me from St. Ephraim. Who then, my Lord, compares to you? The watcher slept. The great was small, the pure baptized, the life who died, the king abased to honor all, praised by your glory. This, I think, delightfully captures this irresolvable tension and mystery between the two natures of Christ. I made a point to, I jotted that down somewhere. I was so excited. This tells you I'm a nerd. When I stumbled on that phrase, I stopped worshiping and wrote it down. But I'm glad I get to incorporate that into talks like this. So this is critical too. The incarnation also reminds us that there may be good reasons for sleeplessness as a form of lament, as a time to listen to or to wrestle with God. And the paradigmatic event for us as Christians is Jesus in his anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, where his closest disciples failed to keep watch. Moreover, the incarnation attests to our own psychosomatic nature, exposing the folly of thinking that lunesta can bring peace to our anxious, restless mind. Though, again, I hasten to add, it seems that we have to leave room for God's mediating grace through pharmaceutical sleep aids. I am not an I'm not a raging fundamentalist, yet anyway. Finally, if sleep hygiene elevates the moral over the metaphysical, a theological perspective gives us the purpose, the ultimate purpose of sleep as God's creatures called to a life into fellowship with God, a life that is also entails discipline and discipleship, where purpose flows from God's very being and the created order that God has established and that we inhabit. So a theological perspective on sleep and insomnia remind us that the stakes of insomnia are considerably higher than the sleep industrial complex would have us to believe. These observations might be described as the core features of a spiritual practice or even a spiritual discipline, which is a spiritual discipline of sleep, which is more than sleep hygiene. Actually, from what I say beyond this, there's nothing new. I want to give a couple real practical insights or points from various authors and writers and thinkers in the Christian faith. And I'm going to focus on the church father Chrysostom in the late 4th century, who was inspired by monastics. In one of his sermons, he urged his congregation to pray before bed. Well, gee, that's revolutionary. If, according to the rules of contemporary hygiene, the bed should be reserved for sleep, sickness, or sex, right, the 3 S's, a Christian perspective would suggest that the bed is also a place of prayer, and crucially, for Chrysostom, it was a place of judgment, a place of judgment. In her work entitled Christians at Home, John Chrysostom and the Domestic Rituals in 4th Century Antioch, you're not going to see that on the New York Times bestseller list. Blake Layerly, she says that the 3rd century bishop, it's late 3rd century, I'm sorry. That sounds wrong. I still think it's 4th. Nevertheless, Chrysostom urged Christians to carefully review their actions throughout the day and to prepare for the next day. And this is what he said in one of his sermons. As judges sit under curtains to deliberate, so too do you. But instead of curtains, seek out a quiet time and place. When you have gotten up from dinner and are about to lie down, then sit in judgment. This is the convenient time for you, and the place is your bed. and your bedroom, and the bedroom. This would, I suspect, break all the rules of contemporary sleep hygiene because it may actually agitate you. It's fascinating to read Chrysostom here because he wanted this teaching to be an ethical spur for his congregation. And he points out that this also, Chrysostom says, this fits in this larger pattern of every night we go to sleep not being entirely sure that we're going to wake up. And if we do wake up because we've passed away, we face divine judgment. This pattern is meant to enforce right action and instill a conception of time by creating a great awareness of this final judgment. I love this. Chrysostom assumed that his parishioners were already praying twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. But then he goes on. You could say he couldn't read his congregation. He urged them to pray in the middle of the night. Yes, the middle of the night. And he anticipated objections to this, right? He says, oh, you say sleep is sweet. Chrysostom countered with, nothing is sweeter than prayer. And then he said this, and I'm quoting now, this will never be found in any parenting manual. If you have children, wake them up also. And let your house, I love this phrase though, let your house become altogether a church during the night. Layerly, in her work, imagines his parishioners protesting. Time out, Chrysostom, like we're not monks, right? But Chrysostom is undeterred, and he references the psalmist David, who as a king never stopped praying day and night. And he said, if a busy king prayed more scrupulously than the monks living in the mountains, your family business can hardly be an excuse. Okay, make what you will of that. I think there's something to be gained from Chrysostom. And if all this sounds a bit crazy, and there's one page left here, so I stumbled on Kelly Kapick's work entitled You're Only Human, where he urges Christians to consider sleep as a spiritual discipline. So I felt somewhat vindicated after reading that. His treatment is brief, but he observes, he makes a really insightful comment. Sleep itself is an act of faith. It is an act of trust. It also reminds us of our lack of control. And while these thoughts in Kapick fall short of a fully formed spiritual practice, I think they lay the groundwork for the inclusion of other historical practices in the history of the faith that I will not talk about in the interest of time. I think Chrysostom anticipated the Daly examen. This is the Jesuit way of thought. Ignatius of Loyola. You can Google it. This is a set of practices to review before bed. Closer to home, evening prayer. Well, this is actually Compline, technically. I love this prayer. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. There's also a world of artwork. I don't know how to appraise art, but these paintings that were reflected on, Therese of Lisieux wrote some theological reflections on a couple of these paintings, and they're poignant. They both depict Christ, the baby Jesus, napping on the cross. What are the implications? Again, I haven't written about these yet because I'm not sure what to do with them. But I think they have something. I think they have something to tell us. So I think it may very well be the case that articulating a discipline of sleep will involve drawing on the rich history of nighttime practices and prayer in the Christian faith. I think practices, once again, that reframe our lives with their habits and dispositions, including our own attitudes and habits, or attitudes towards sleep, they reframe them within God's divine economy. So here are some questions for consideration. Again, there's no time to talk about these, but these are the kind of questions that have been bouncing around in my mind. If I back off the caffeine, I may actually be able to settle on one of them. Has sleep become thoroughly secularized? I think yes. But if so, what are the effects? How are we to think of sleep in light of the incarnation and resurrection? I've tried to do some of that here. What are the practices, habits, and dispositions that we can retrieve from the practice of Christianity in past eras? How might those practices be altered and reshaped to fit our contemporary cultural context? Can Chrysostom be resurrected for today? I think yes, although again, I would not advocate waking up your kids in the middle of the night, although maybe on a Friday night. They may need therapy later for that, I'm not sure. What do our attitudes towards sleep reveal about us and our understandings of the world and God? Our need for control, our fears and failures, our ultimate commitments, our sense of importance. One final prayer. This is one of my favorite little prayer books. It's called The Diary of Private Prayer, written by John Daly. He was a principal at New College in Edinburgh, where I studied, but well before my time. And in this Diary of Private Prayer, there's a morning and evening prayer for 31 days, for the month. There are a couple of prayers, evening prayers, that I think are poignant. And so these are the last two slides. He prays this: "O thou who art from everlasting to everlasting, I would turn my thoughts to thee as the hours of darkness and sleep begin. O Son of my soul, I rejoice to know that all night I shall be under the unsleeping eye of one who dwells in eternal light. To thy care, O Father, I would now commend my body and my soul. All day thou hast watched over me, and thy companionship has filled my heart with peace. Let me not go through any part of this night unaccompanied by thee. Give me sound and refreshing sleep." What a radical thought, praying to God for help in falling asleep. "Give me safety from all perils. Give me in my sleep freedom from restless dreams. Give me control of my thoughts if I should lie awake. Give me wisdom to remember that the night was made for sleeping and not for the harboring of anxious thoughts or fretful or shameful thoughts. And give me grace if, as I lie abed, I think at all, to think upon thee." Oh my goodness, that was a lot longer. And well, there you go. So thank you for your time and attention.